War is extremely complex, as it always has been and always will be. Imagine how much more complex war got when we brought planes and tanks to the battlefield in World War I. Now, I need you to imagine a flying tank that breathes fire and has an intelligent, variable fire and auto-targeting cannon on the top of it. You now have a dragon and its dragon rider. How would that change war? Well, I'm the Worldsmith, and I plan to address some of the complexities of this problem in today's video. Alright, first things first, we have to define some stuff, right? Because this is a very complex problem, and there's a lot of variables that can go into this entire issue, right? As with most world-building issues, believe it or not, if you haven't noticed that pattern already, you're going to see more of it. Anyway, carrying on. So first we have to establish what are dragons like. All right, let's narrow that down a bit because that's a bit broad. Are they smart? Are they more like beasts? Are they somewhere in between, right? Are they magical in nature or more mundane? That would be like, do they fly and breathe fire because of magic, or do they have like a second belly to store gas and a, flint or whatever in their throat to breathe fire? That's an important question to address because that helps determine the power level that the dragon will have. Do they have leathery skin or hard scales? And whichever, how hard or tough is that skin or those scales? Another important question, because these things have to be defined to know how the dragon's going to affect war. We're not even done. How big are the dragons? How fast are the dragons? Are there different types of dragons? And if so, how do they differ? What other notable abilities do dragons have? Can they even fly? Because some dragons don't fly in some fantasies, or certain types of dragons don't fly. Well, next thing, what can their riders do? Riders, not writers. Anyway, if they even have dragon riders, that is, because maybe they don't need them. Do they have magic? What other abilities might they have besides magic? Do the dragon and the dragon rider share some kind of spiritual connection or a mental connection in order to communicate, or is it all hand signals and guesswork or shouting? We'll see. How is that rider strapped onto the dragon? Because, inverted flight requires some degree of security. Planes, warplanes and even normal planes that you might see that you might fly in have seat belts in case of emergency or in case of inversion. Otherwise, you just hit the top of the plane. It wouldn't be very safe. Well, dragons don't really have a canopy. It doesn't really work out too good. Now, so we just asked, do the riders have magic? Well, if they do, you have to establish what capabilities magic has. And that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother video. That gets pretty big. So we're just going to leave that be and kind of establish a baseline coming up soon. Now, I just mentioned establishing a baseline. As for establishing a baseline, we kind of need to set these things in place just so we can talk on even ground for what we're talking about for the sake of how these things might change war, right? So let's just say that for the instance of our example, dragons are fairly large. Imagine like a corner store or a semi-truck sized dragon. Pretty big, but nothing monstrous. It's not as big as a mountain. I'm looking at you, Encalagon. Anyway, they're inherently magical, with magical fire and a magical life force that their rider can tap in order to cast spells. They possess human-level intellect at the very minimum, and some go beyond that, although their magic is not something that they can intentionally use for things besides flight and fire. Their fire cannot melt stone with anything resembling speed. I like the melting stone thing from Game of Thrones, I really do. But it's, for the sake of this example, a little bit too powerful, right? Cool. So their riders are going to be excellent warriors and fairly competent spellcasters. The question is, what does that mean? Well, we'll see in a minute. Dragons will also be having scales that will have enough hardness and strength to them to where it will take significantly more force than a normal bow could achieve in order to pierce. And because I'm a sucker, of course, they fly. So another thing we have to kind of cover real quick is just how common are dragons and dragon riders in any scenario. Your baseline established, how common is a dragon and a dragon rider? Because that's just going to establish right off the bat how much of a player they are on a field. Because if they're rare and they show up, you're very likely not prepared for it. But if they're fairly common and, you know, well, then you're just kind of expecting it. That's kind of how that works. So if dragons are fairly rare, they do have to be a pretty significant force in the battlefield, if for no other reason than for sheer dramatic impact. If they're a bit more common, however, they might be something more like elite knights or something in that world, right? You know, like you have like a knight, you have a dragon knight, maybe. But on the other hand, if they're super common, they might just be like something that everyone just rides into battle, like your horse. Like, what's your dragon's name? Oh, his name is Finn. I don't know. So in our example, we're going to have the dragons and dragon riders be more like that elite rare knight thing, right? They're going to be a few of them on a battlefield, and the number of them goes up with the scale of the battle, like you would have the number of normal units scale up with the size of a battle. You're going to have more knights in a bigger battle. You're going to have more catapults in a bigger battle. That's just the nature of the beast. The more powerful each army is, the more likely they're going to bring the full force of their might against each other. All right? Cool. Carrying on. So, what mundane counters exist against the dragon? Now, quick clarification on mundane for anybody who doesn't immediately get what I'm saying. Mundane would be essentially anything that's not magic. Okay, cool. Pretty well established. Cool. So, dragons are going to be a pretty serious force to contend with in our example so far, right? They fly, they breathe fire, they can't be pierced with normal arrows, they have a pretty powerful spellcaster riding on their back. They're nothing to trifle with. I like the word trifle. Anyway, but they aren't going to be melting stone at any kind of significant speed, like we said. So a castle might be of use. But I suspect that the castles in a world filled with dragons would not have open top walls for nearly the length of time as castles in our world. It just doesn't make sense. You'd want to have something between you and dragonfire, if you ask me. So let's go with that as a start. If you don't have any kind of magical, power to protect your castle, the castle would likely be quite a bit shorter than it would be in real life. Normally this would be because building a tall citadel or other central building would be a monstrous expense if it's full thickness the whole way up. And you really couldn't do thinner walls up higher in the real world because this would be because building a taller citadel or other central building of a castle would be a monstrous expense just because the thickness of the walls the whole way up would be insane. That would be really expensive to do. And you couldn't really do thinner walls the higher you got like you do in the real world because, this part of the castle is subject to destruction and attack just as much as the lower sections, even though it's far higher in the air. Now, as for an offensive measure, just a quick example. Later on into Game of Thrones, I believe season 7, you will see a scorpion, which is a form of siege engine. It looks kind of like a giant crossbow that can pivot up and down and turn around on an axis. That would be a pretty effective tool against our dragons so far, as that projectile would have significantly more force than an arrow would. But, unless you're Sir Bronn of the Blackwater or just as lucky or skilled as he is, don't expect to have the dragon be an easy target, especially when it's an expected countermeasure. The reason why it was so effective against Drogon, well, honestly, they didn't expect it. They didn't know what was going on. Don't think that he'll fall for that again. Now, carrying on. So, what about magical countering options? Well, magic's pretty cool. This is pretty closely connected with how powerful magic is and what it can do in general, as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier in the video. But to get a little bit more specific, what kind of spells do you need in order to hurt a dragon? Are they rare and very powerful, or are they more commonplace and fairly easy to access? For our example, the spells that hurt dragons are not too limited in scope. There's quite a few options. But they require a very powerful singular spellcaster or a group of spellcasters to cast, so they're going to be a little bit difficult to use commonly. But when it comes to defensive options, well, let's get on defensive options for magic then. You're essentially limited only by your imagination, as with almost everything else in the world of creativity. For a quick example of what we're going to be doing, imagine something pretty similar to the dome that went over Atlantis in Disney's Atlantis. It will stop physical forces and magical forces, but it will have a limit known only to the enchanters that put it in place and possibly to the commander of the castle. Although the dome over Atlantis didn't appear to directly have a limit as to what it could do, but we're going to go with it having a limit just for the sake of my sanity, I guess. Anyway, so our example is going to combine the designs of a castle that I mentioned before with this dome for maximum security. So this is like a serious hard point. This is a massive, monstrous fortress centered around protecting itself from threats like dragons and other magical assaults. So this is not like a pretty Disney castle. This is a fort. All right. Think we got everything covered? We'll go with that. Yeah, so moving on. All right, so one more point before we carry on to a little bit more thinking on the problem itself. Little bit more groundwork, just a little bit. Dragons and dragon riders will inherently counter each other. So I have a dragon and a dragon rider, and you have a dragon and a dragon rider. They fight each other, and whoever wins has control of the sky. Very similar to how a tank would counter a tank or a plane would counter a plane. Dragons naturally would counter other dragons, as they would have the same general scope of abilities. Then your situation in the skies ends up becoming a dogfight. Or perhaps I should say dragon fight. No? Okay, whatever. For control of the skies, and thus a major battlefield advantage through controlling the air. Because dragons are just naturally going to be the best option to counter dragons. They're just as agile, they're just as intelligent. There's no extreme difficulty in aiming to the same degree as ground-based options, assuming that one of the counter options to dragons isn't some kind of homing missile, magical missile, whatever. You get the point. It can get, whatever. All right. So to recap our example situation, we have an intelligent, fire-breathing, and arrow-proof dragon that flies, ridden by a decently powerful spellcaster and warrior. They probably use magic in tandem with one another to some extent, and the rider would wield something like a bow for any other ranged combat he wouldn't be able to use magic for, or perhaps as an ability to deliver some spells, which is an idea I've been playing with recently. Some people have touched on this before, but I haven't personally seen anything really cool involving it. I'm going to talk about that later. Bows and magic, that is. Yeah, okay. So, this pair, our pair, is one of 12 other dragon and dragon rider pairs on our example battlefield, with our side having 7 dragons and dragon riders to the enemy's 5. So we outnumber them a little bit. The problem is, our dragon rider and dragon are on the offensive against a castle, and this is a skirmish initiated in order to test the castle's magical defenses. They know that the castle has a magical barrier, but they don't know how strong that barrier is. The enemy sends out their riders to counter our own, which seems to mean that they're concerned about a prolonged attack on the barrier, or that this is a full-fledged attack rather than a test. Our riders are going to have to protect themselves from the enemy dragons, as well as allied siege engines and siege wizards from anything that the bad dragons do. I can't say a bad dragon, can I? We'll go with it. Now, if they're lucky, they may even take the castle today, even though that's not their objective. It depends on how the enemy's defenses hold. So from here, the particulars of the fight must be really sorted out as you go along writing the particular fight. And we could talk about it, but that's just the stage is set, right? So our stage is set, my point is made. Let's review, really, what just throwing a dragon, and it's dragon rider, of course. Why do I keep forgetting the rider or the dragon? I keep on saying one or the other, whatever. But let's think about what all we had to think and change in consideration of a dragon being on the battlefield. So castles are of stronger design and way more expensive right off the bat. We have to devise, and thus our characters in the universe have to devise intentional magic and intentional siege engines centered around attacking and shooting at the other dragons that are in the sky. So there's that. That's not even addressing anything related to how the normal infantryman has to react to there being a dragon above his head. We didn't even touch on that. We're just talking about like the big things. But you kind of get the point. It's a very complex issue, and one thing changed. We added a flying fire breathing tank with an auto turret on the top, and everything about the medieval war had to shift around that piece. The same kind of thing happens with magic, and we'll talk about that to a greater extent in another video, as I mentioned before. So I really hope that you have a solid grasp on what considerations you should have to make when you bring dragons and dragon riders into your fantasy world's wars. I didn't misspeak that. I'm actually impressed with myself. Anyway, the variables range drastically from what dragons bring to the table to what can be done to counter them and what has to be done to counter them, honestly. And there's probably some more besides that slipped my mind, but anyway, as with as with every other world-building issue so far that I've encountered, dragons and dragon riders have proven to be more than meets the eye. Cue the Transformers theme. Don't get scared of them, though. Dragons smell fear. Don't hate me. Anyway, so if you enjoyed this video, please click the little pin and the anvil on the left side of the screen. It should be there. I might be pointing the wrong way. We're going to go with it, though. I've got plenty more awesome content on the way, and I would love to share it all with you guys. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Yeah, thanks for watching The Worldsmith. Hope to see you again soon. Farewell for now.